Shalom from Israel. I'm Sorko-Ram reporting to you from Tel Aviv, and I want to welcome you to Israel Frontline, your guide to Israel and the Middle East. We want to give you a biblical perspective on political and social current events in Israel as they happen and why they happen. What you will hear on this program will contrast sharply with the biased reporting we are receiving from most of the world media. This is our third in our four-part series about the restoration of Israel. Today we will focus on the events that led up to Israel's struggle to birth a Jewish state after 2,000 years of exile. On the program today, Jews and Arabs prepare for battle. What was the Arab Revolt? Were there only Arab refugees? In the second part of the program, our panel guests will offer their views of the Jewish-Arab relationships at the time. Even as the Nazis in Europe proceeded in putting the finishing touches on their final solution to murder every Jew they could get their hands on in the 1930s, the tension between the Arabs and Jews and British forces ruling in Israel was getting ready to explode. All parties knew that the end of the British mandate in the land was inevitable, and both Jews and Arabs were preparing for the battles that they knew were bound to come. The last few decades have been characterized with ever-increasing violence from all directions. Jewish paramilitary organizations guarded their communities from Arab raids. Jewish fighters bombed British train tracks and stations. Arabs attacked the British and the Jews. The British did whatever they could to appease the Arabs and keep the Jews out, and on it went. These rounds of violence became more and more bloody. In 1929, the Arab population, led by the Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, was determined to expel their Jewish neighbors at all cost, and they turned against them in an unprecedented series of attacks. 133 Jews were killed, many in such atrocious acts of violence that the British were compelled to kill many Arabs in order to restore peace. The attacks were a watershed for the Jewish-Arab relationship in the country. The idea of both peoples living peacefully side by side seemed to grow less and less realistic to everyone. In 1936, things got even worse. What is now known as the Arab Revolt began. For 3 years, the Arabs attacked British targets, murdered hundreds of Jews, and more than 5,000 Arab brethren. Essentially, the Arabs were also using the revolt as an excuse to get rid of their rivals and enemies in the Arab society. The Arab Revolt was a response to several developments that deeply concerned them. In fact, as the British attempts to try and keep Jews out of Israel intensified, by hook or by crook, more and more Jews were finding ways to get to Israel. This was tied to the rise of fascism in Europe, and Jews were streaming into Israel. The Arabs watched their overwhelming Arab majority quickly turn towards a soon-to-be Jewish majority. To make things worse, the Jews were building new cities, creating new businesses, and building up the governing bodies of a state. In the eyes of the Arabs, the British were not doing enough to keep more Jews from settling in the Holy Land, and they wanted things changed, and changed fast. They demanded that the British hand over control of the country to an Arab majority governing body. They also demanded a complete end to all Jewish immigration to the country. in order to maintain their demographic advantage over the Jewish population. At all cost, the Arabs intended to prevent a Jewish state from being born. By and large, the Arab revolt failed. At the end of 3 years of rioting, violence, and demonstrations, the Arabs had obtained none of their objectives. Moreover, many Arab leaders were killed, whether at the hands of the British or by their political enemies in the Arab community. The fact is that at the end of the revolt, the Arab community was left without many of their military and political leaders, a matter which would bear grave consequences for them in the 1948 War of Independence. At last, the time approached for the British Mandate Army to pack up and leave Israel. The United Nations in November 1947 resolved that the land would be divided between Jews and Arabs, according to their population size. This meant that the Arabs would receive twice as much land as the Jews. The British, favoring the Arabs, had put great effort into forcibly preventing Jews from reaching the shores of the Holy Land over the previous 20 years, ignoring the fact that during this very time, the Nazis were killing millions of European Jews. So in 1947, when the UN voted on partitioning the land after World War II, the Jews in Israel numbered only 650,000, and the Arabs 1.3 million. But the Arabs were determined that the Jews would not possess a single meter of the Holy Land. But the Jewish people in Israel were determined to birth their own homeland, their only shelter for the remnant that survived the European Holocaust. But the Jews were not ready for what happened next. The Jewish Virtual Library gives this account of what happened after the historic United Nations resolution to give a homeland to the Jewish people. Thousands of wealthy Arabs left in anticipation of a war. Thousands more responded to Arab leaders' calls to get out of the way of the advancing Arab armies. A handful were expelled by Jewish forces, but most simply fled to avoid being caught in the crossfire of a battle. Had the Arabs accepted the 1947 UN resolution, not a single Palestinian would have become a refugee, and an independent Arab state would now exist beside Israel. The first to leave were roughly 30,000 wealthy Arabs who anticipated the upcoming war and fled to neighboring Arab countries to await its end. Less affluent Arabs from the mixed cities of the Holy Land moved to all Arab towns to stay with relatives or friends. All of those who left were certain they would be returning to their homes after an early Arab victory, as Palestinian nationalist Arif el-Arif explained in his history of the 1948 war. The Arabs thought it would take no more than a day or two from the time the Arab armies crossed the border until all Jewish colonies were conquered and the enemy would throw down his arms and cast himself on their mercy. Meanwhile, Jewish leaders urged the Arabs to remain in their homes and become citizens of Israel. Early on, the Assembly of Palestine Jewry issued this appeal on October 2, 1947. We will do everything in our power to maintain peace and establish a cooperation gainful to both Jews and Arabs. It is here and now, from Jerusalem itself, that a call must go out to the Arab nations to join forces with Jewry and the destined Jewish state and work shoulder to shoulder for our common good, for the peace and progress of sovereign equals. But it was not to be. It's estimated the number of Arab refugees in the war was 670,000 in total, although other historians believe the number was closer to 530,000. For the sake of perspective, in the years that followed World War II, it's estimated that 35 million people were displaced from their homes. Here's where things start to get interesting. Out of all those who were displaced after World War II, there's only one small group in the whole world who are still considered refugees today, almost 70 years later. Can you guess who it is? It's the Palestinians. We will explore why there are still Palestinian refugees today in next week's program. But for now, let me say that it is an unprecedented and a unique case. Here's something many people are not aware of. There were also Jewish refugees, and their cause for displacement is rooted in a completely unreasonable decision. Even before the 1948 war broke out, many Arab countries surrounding Israel expelled the Jews living in their countries. In most cases, Jews were forced out, robbed of possessions worth billions, and stripped of their rights. Most fled with nothing but the clothes on their back. These were Jewish communities centuries old, which had no direct connection to the war in Israel. Jews living in Arab countries numbered almost 900,000. But by the mid-50s, the vast majority of them were no longer there, and all their properties and assets had been appropriated by their Arab neighbors. Many of these Jewish refugees arrived in Israel and became part of the nation. Not one of them claims to be a refugee today. I don't want you to get the wrong impression. We care deeply for those Arabs who lost their homes in 1948. But it seems the world has forgotten that it wasn't just the Arabs in Israel, but almost 1 million innocent Jews in the Middle East who were ordered to leave their homes and their possessions. In a way, we cannot understand. We do see the hand of God at work when He decided it was time to bring the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob back home. Jeremiah, who is known as the weeping prophet, held out this hope 2,500 years ago, part of which has come to pass and part of which is yet to come. So do not be afraid, Jacob, my servant. Do not be dismayed, Israel, declares the Lord. I will surely save you out of a distant place, your descendants from the land of their exile. Jacob will again have peace and security, and no one will make him afraid. I am with you and will save you, declares the Lord. Stay tuned. We will be right back with our panel of guests to further examine and discuss these events.
Every move of God has a sound, has a song, has its own music. Maoz Music Making for Kids program was created to help raise up a new generation of talented musicians in the body of Messiah in Israel. We want to give the children of today the tools to grow and excel in music so that they can create the new music relevant to reaching their generation. Our hope is that they will be able to speak to the world through music and tell others about their faith in Messiah Yeshua.
Maoz Israel Ministries is a Messianic Jewish non-profit organization based in Tel Aviv. We exist to be a witness of the good news to the people of Israel through outreach, discipleship, and raising up godly leaders. We translate and publish outstanding faith books in Hebrew and powerful testimony books to reach non-believers. We have a Hebrew outreach website with original media content produced by our team. We support the Hebrew-speaking congregation Tiferet Yeshua in Tel Aviv. We sponsor and host seminars and conferences. We support our Arab Christian brothers who love Israel and the God of Israel. Our I Stand With Israel Fund serves as a benevolence outreach, meeting the practical needs of Israeli believers. Our dream is to see God's promises fulfilled until the day when all Israel will be saved.
Welcome back to Israel Frontline. Our panel guests are now ready to discuss where did the term Palestine and Palestinian originate. Joining me today are Mati Shoshani, Director of Operations for TBN Israel, Shani Ferguson, co-founder of Yeshua Israel Ministries, and Albert Vexler, Deputy Director of Global Aliyah. And they are all from Jerusalem. Thank you for being here.
It's awesome to be here.
So here's the question. Did Arabs call themselves Palestinians for 1900 years? After all, we're saying that the name Palestine was known for 1900 years. Albert, where did the name Palestine come from? It's not in the Old Testament. It's not in the New Testament as far as the Holy Land being called Palestine. So where did it come from?
Well, we look at the history and we see that the Jewish revolt of Bar Kokhba ended in a very, very sad way by Hadrian killing hundreds of thousands of Jews. And we see, basically it's a curse that Hadrian put on this whole land. He stopped the name, the province of Judea, and he started calling it the province of Palestine. And he was basically trying to do one thing, to say that this is a land of the Philistines, the arch enemies of the Israel of old.
I just want to comment that you need to understand this in context. The word Philistines in Hebrew is paleshet. It means the people who invade. Mm-hmm. So it was like, it's almost a pun and a revenge at the same time. I also want to add that historically speaking, when Israel was founded, now I know everyone today says the land of Israel, the people of Israel, and so on and so forth. It wasn't obvious that it would be called Israel. They were, they had a discussion.
Exactly.
1947 came around, and they were thinking, wait, what should it be called? Judea? It wasn't just Judea, it was more than that. So they came up with Israel. But, when we're talking about the Great Rebellion and after that, this wasn't...
Which was back in
the second century.
135.
In the second century. When you're talking about in that time, it wasn't Israel. It was Judea. And before that, there was Samaria, the extension of the land.
Actually, you mentioned it's not mentioned in the Bible, but if you look in the maps, the Bible maps, then they mistakenly always pretty often say the Palestine of time of Jesus, and this is absolutely crazy.
It's called Judea of the time of Jesus.
Of course, and there was no Palestine of time of Jesus. But of course, this name stuck, so to say, and
actually in the New Testament, it's called Israel.
Of course.
Mm-hmm. So they did have this concept of Israel in the time of Yeshua. Jesus.
But it's interesting to notice also that the Jewish settlers, as they were called, Ishuv, the newcomers, the different waves of Aliyah, they called themselves Palestinians. The Jewish people...
No, it was just the name of the country.
So what
it made sense.
It
was
are
the
you
name of the
talking
country.
about now?
He's talking about the 1880s and onward.
Yeah.
So, that's
so
what
the
people were
Jews called themselves Palestinians
Yes.
because...
Well, they called themselves the people of Palestine. They were still Jews.
Right.
And that's a distinction that has to be made. The first time people, identified themselves as Palestinians, as a nationality, as an ethnicity, is the Palestinians. That came much later on. We're talking at least 48 and more often
it's later.
After 1967.
This is later.
Yeah, that's much later.
The change comes in 1948 by the Jewish people saying, now we are Israelis, because the state of Israel was restored, and they see, of course, proudly.
Well, because it was their state again. It was
exactly,
their state.
Exactly, but proudly and rightly they say
yes.
They see themselves as the Israelis, and now who are the Palestinian Arabs. Well, they say, well, now we are the Palestinians.
No, the 1948, the Jews stopped calling themselves Palestinian Jews, and they called themselves Israeli Jews. And the Arabs, even today, would call that there are the Arabs of 1948, and there are the Arabs of 1967. And the Arabs of 1948 are the ones that received citizenship. They were here, they received citizenship, and now they're Israeli Arabs. And the ones that became their own people group, which are in essence the same people.
The refugees, the ones that fled from Israel,
are what the Arabs call the Arabs of 1967, and they became, in essence, their own people group.
And it's a very unique process of creation of an identity. With most countries, you've lived in a land, you have a religion or language or tradition that sets you apart. This wasn't the case with these. Their identity was formed by being opposed against, and violently so, against the state of Israel.
And they had to do that because Arabs naturally, culturally, are very tribal and clan-oriented, family-oriented. So you had all these different Arabs that had come from all these different countries, and they were just in the area of Israel-Palestine, and they had no national identity. And so it was hard to kind of get them to agree on any particular thing. Once they finally decided that they were going to be a Palestinian people, they were able to the leaders were able to use them as more
I just want to point out something that most people don't know, is that the history in this land, when people say, oh, it's the Jews and the Palestinians, there were no Palestinians when we were talking about, there were Arabs, and the Arabs weren't talking about just what we call the land of Israel today. They were talking about a pan-Arabian state, something from Iraq that included Egypt. They were talking Lebanon, Syria, all one state. So the Arab national movement, quote unquote, it wasn't one that was limited to Israel. It was one across the region.
Okay, the reason, though, they can't even today do that as much as they want to have this pan-Arab state or a caliphate or whatever you call it, is because they're so tribal-oriented.
Tribal and religious
they can't agree on who's
Right.
going to be in charge and what they'll call
just
themselves.
to sum up what you're saying, the Ottoman Empire had, among all the other lands that they had, the Holy Land, from 1600 to the
1917.
1917. Right. And so what did Arabs call themselves that lived in the Holy Land during the Ottoman Empire?
Well, the thing is, the Ottoman Empire was not Arab. Here's a distinction. I know
Right.
you know this. For the Ottoman Empire was Muslim. Ottomans are Turks. They're not Arabs, and
That's right.
it's a mistake many people make. The people in the land, their affiliation was like this. First, the family. So let's say in a village, and at the time most people lived in a village, you belong to some family, so it's your family name. Then the village or the region, and that's pretty much where it ended. Their affiliation, it wasn't like today you feel, this allegiance to your state. They didn't have that. They were part of an empire that had Muslims and non-Muslims and Arabs and non-Arabs, and it was part of that. It wasn't one cohesive. So
Make it very simple.
Yeah.
They were proud of being Arabs, and
Yeah.
they called themselves Arabs.
here in the land, yes. But
Right.
that started in the 20th century. If you
Yeah,
go
the
before that,
nationalist
they were
movement
part of the
started.
Ottoman Empire, and they were part of a
Listen,
clan.
I moved to Israel in 1967. I lived a few months on the Mount of Olives. I met lots of Arabs. Nobody ever told me they were a Palestinian. Basically, they said we're Jordanians, or we were Jordanians, or we're Arabs, or we're Christians, or we're Muslims. They had an identity crisis, I believe, but they did not call themselves Palestinians in 1967.
Right, they're actually Palestinians. Even today, they had some footage even that you can watch where the leaders in Gaza are saying, we know we're, al-Musri, or our
We're
last
Egyptian,
name
yeah.
is Hussein, our last name is Egyptian, and we know that we belong to these families, but we call ourselves Palestinians because we're part of a cause.
You're touching on something that's really important to note. That many people, and this is a claim made by the Palestinian people today, they're saying, we were here for centuries. That's not the case. What happened, and we described this in previous shows, what happened during the late 19th century and the early 20th century is that hundreds of thousands of Arabs from around the Arab world,
attracted here.
they were attracted to this area because of financial prosperity and opportunities, and came here. So these aren't people who were, there are people who have been here for a very long time, but many of them, if you're talking about the big cities, especially the Gaza Strip, people came in from Egypt, people came in from Saudi Arabia, from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon. They just stormed into this area for financial reasons. So again, their identity here was a very new one. It wasn't one that went back for centuries or even generations.
So do you think that if there had never been a man called Yasser Arafat, who is sort of the creator, not just the father, but the creator of the Palestinian people, because there wasn't that idea or concept before. Do you think that if he had not been born, let's say, do you think that the Palestinian people, so-called, would have created themselves?
I believe if he would not have born, somebody else would have done the same. And I think he was also like just a figure that was chosen for that task, because we talk about movement that is starting in Egypt and by the help of the Egyptian regime in the beginning of the 60s. And so we are not talking about Arafat as a personality being the father of Palestinian nation.
He represents the struggle against Israel. That's
the best way to put it. But we are talking about a very unfortunate group of people, because I mean, really, they did live here. Of course, we know that the numbers and all of these statistics that we see
hugely inflated.
Are hugely inflated, and we see that there's a lot of debate and discussion going on in these matters. But this doesn't. Well, it's a tragic story.
Well, I think the saddest part is that the younger generation at different points since Israel was founded were interested in integrating to Israeli society. They were interested in learning Hebrew and just getting a job and whatever. And the radical Islam kind of swooped them up to keep that separation. Because if Arabs just decide to become Israelis and they integrate, then there is no conflict and there's no hope in the Islamic mind of ever using international pressure or whatever to delegitimize Israel and destroy Israel.
The worst part is this political game that the Arab nations were playing in this whole thing, because they first, when they said to the Arabs that lived in the so-called Palestine in the beginning of the independence war, get out of our way. We as victorious Arab
such a huge topic.
We'll come in and we'll clean it up. We'll give you the Jewish homes.
We'll have to talk about that another time, because this is all the time we have. We hope we gave you insight that will help you understand Israel and her struggles to survive. For more of my articles about Israel, sign up to the free monthly Maoz Israel report at maozisrael.org/sign up. Remember to join us next week for the conclusion of our 4-part series about the restoration of Israel. We will talk about Palestinian refugees and why their numbers continue to grow today. On behalf of our team and myself, blessings and shalom from Tel Aviv.